July 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 nations gather in conference rooms overlooking the White Mountains. World War II still rages across Europe and the Pacific, but these economists, bankers, and government officials aren't here to discuss military strategy. They're here to redesign the entire global financial system. And whether they fully understand it or not, they're about to hand the United States a form of power that no empire in history has ever possessed. The power to create money that the entire world must use. What happens in that hotel over the coming weeks will reshape international finance for generations. But Bretton Woods is only the first of 3 seismic shifts in American economic policy that will fundamentally alter how the world conducts trade, accumulates wealth, and distributes power. Each shift concentrates more economic leverage in Washington. Each creates winners and losers on a global scale. And each demonstrates a truth that most people never fully grasp. When America changes its economic policy, the world doesn't get a vote. It simply adapts or suffers. This is the story of how American economic decisions became global mandates, how the dollar became the world's inescapable currency, and how 3 pivotal moments, 1944, 1971, and 1974, created a financial architecture that still governs your life today, regardless of where you live or what currency you think you use. The United States emerged from World War II in a position of economic dominance unmatched in modern history. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, American factories hummed with production. While other nations counted their dead and calculated reconstruction costs, America held approximately 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. This wasn't just economic strength. This was overwhelming, undeniable supremacy. And the architects of the post-war order knew exactly how to leverage it. The Bretton Woods Conference took its name from the small New Hampshire town where delegates assembled at the Mount Washington Hotel. The stated goal was noble: create a stable international monetary system that would facilitate trade, prevent competitive currency devaluations, and avoid the economic chaos that had contributed to the Great Depression and subsequent global war. The solution they devised would accomplish those goals, but it would also create what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later call America's exorbitant privilege. The system worked like this. The United States would peg the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other nations would peg their currencies to the dollar at fixed but adjustable rates, typically within a 1% band. This created a pyramid structure with gold at the top, the dollar in the middle, and every other currency at the bottom. But here's the crucial detail. Only the dollar was convertible to gold, and only for foreign governments and central banks, not for private citizens. 2 new institutions emerged from Bretton Woods to manage this system. The International Monetary Fund would monitor exchange rates and provide loans to nations facing balance of payments crises. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we now know as the World Bank, would fund post-war reconstruction and development in less developed nations. Both institutions would be headquartered in Washington, and both would operate largely under American influence due to voting structures that weighted power according to economic contributions. By 1960, the United States accounted for approximately 28 to 40% of the world's GDP, depending on how it's measured, with some estimates suggesting the figure reached nearly 1/3 of global output. This economic weight, combined with the dollar's position as the central reserve currency, gave America extraordinary advantages. The country could run persistent trade and budget deficits that would bankrupt other nations. When America spent more than it earned, it simply issued more dollars. Foreign governments needed those dollars to settle international accounts, to peg their own currencies, and to hold as reserves. This created automatic demand for American debt. The U.S. could borrow cheaply because the entire world needed to absorb dollars. But this privilege came with an obligation. The United States had to maintain enough gold to back the dollars circulating internationally. And as the 1,960 seconds progressed, that obligation became impossible to fulfill. The Vietnam War was expensive. The Great Society programs launched by President Lyndon Johnson were expensive. American spending, both military and domestic, accelerated throughout the 1,960 seconds. Dollars flooded the global economy, and foreign governments began to notice something troubling. There were more dollars circulating internationally than America had gold to back. France. France under President Charles de Gaulle became particularly aggressive about demanding gold in exchange for the dollars it held. De Gaulle understood that the Bretton Woods system gave America enormous advantages while forcing other nations to accept depreciating dollars. Beginning in 1965, France began converting dollar reserves to gold, and other nations watched nervously. If everyone demanded gold simultaneously, America's reserves would vanish. The system would collapse. By 1971, the math had become unsustainable. The United States held approximately $11 billion worth of gold at the official $35 per ounce price. But foreign governments and central banks held over $40 billion that were theoretically convertible to gold. The promises exceeded the assets by a factor of 4 to 1. Something had to give. On the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television to announce what he called temporary measures to address currency speculation. Among these measures was the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. No consultation with allies, no international conference, no gradual transition, a unilateral decision that would end the Bretton Woods system and fundamentally alter global finance. Nixon framed this as a temporary emergency measure to be reversed once reforms were implemented. It was never temporary. The gold window never reopened. The word temporarily was simply the way governments make permanent changes sound acceptable. In December 1971, representatives from 10 major developed nations met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and hammered out an agreement they hoped would rescue the fixed exchange rate system. They devalued the dollar, allowing greater fluctuations in currency values. The arrangement lasted barely 15 months. By early 1973, the Smithsonian Agreement had collapsed. The major currencies began floating freely against each other, their values determined by market forces rather than government pegs. For the first time in modern history, the world's dominant currency was backed by nothing except the promise of the government that issued it. This was pure fiat money. The dollar's value derived not from gold, not from silver, not from any commodity, but from confidence in American economic strength and the government's commitment to manage the currency responsibly. The implications were staggering. America could now create dollars without any constraint except inflation and market confidence. There was no gold reserve to limit money creation. No physical anchor to discipline policy. The Federal Reserve could expand the money supply essentially at will, limited only by the abstract concern that excessive creation would erode purchasing power and destroy trust. But Nixon and his advisors understood that abandoning gold created a new problem. If the dollar was no longer backed by anything tangible, what would maintain global demand for it? Why would other countries continue holding dollars as reserves when the U.S. could inflate them away without constraint? The solution would come from an unlikely source. Not a commodity buried in vaults, but one pumped from beneath desert sands. October 1973. The Yom Kippur War erupts as Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack against Israel. The United States provides emergency military aid to Israel. In response, the Arab members of OPEC impose an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel, particularly targeting the United States, Japan, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. The embargo lasts from October 1973 to March 1974. During those months, oil prices quadruple from roughly $3 per barrel to $12. Gas stations across America display no gas signs. Cars line up for blocks hoping to fill their tanks. The embargo exposes an uncomfortable reality. Modern industrial economies run on oil, and a handful of nations control the supply. But crisis creates opportunity, and the Nixon administration saw one. If oil could be linked to the dollar the way the dollar had once been linked to gold, perpetual demand for dollars would be assured. Every nation needed energy. If energy could only be purchased with dollars, every nation would need dollars. The petrodollar system was born from this logic. In 1974, Treasury Secretary William Simon and his deputy Jerry Parsky traveled to Saudi Arabia for a series of meetings that remained largely secret until documents were declassified decades later. The deal they negotiated was straightforward in its terms but revolutionary in its implications. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. The Saudis would invest their surplus oil revenues in U.S. Treasury securities and other American assets. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia, sell advanced weapons systems to the kingdom, and support the ruling family politically. Other OPEC nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. Within a short time, the vast majority of global oil transactions were denominated in dollars. Estimates suggest that by the late 1972, roughly 75% of international oil transactions used dollars, with most of the remainder in British pounds. By the time the system fully matured, approximately 80% of global oil trade occurred in dollars, a figure that has remained relatively stable for decades. The mechanics of petrodollar recycling created a self-reinforcing cycle. Oil exporting nations accumulated enormous dollar surpluses. From 1974 through 1981 alone, OPEC members amassed a cumulative current account surplus of approximately $450 billion. 90% of this surplus went to Arab countries of the Persian Gulf and Libya. These nations had relatively small populations and economies in early stages of industrialization. They couldn't efficiently invest such massive cash inflows domestically, so the money flowed back to Western financial markets, particularly American ones. Gulf sovereign wealth funds became major investors in U.S. Treasury bonds, American corporations, real estate, and financial instruments. This recycling of petrodollars meant that oil importing nations paid dollars for energy. Those dollars accumulated in oil exporting nations, and those nations reinvested the dollars in American assets. The money left America to buy oil, then returned to America as investment capital. For the United States, this system delivered extraordinary benefits. The country could run virtually unlimited trade deficits because the rest of the world needed to accumulate dollars to purchase energy. American inflation could be exported globally because other nations needed to hold dollar reserves. Interest rates on American government debt remained low because oil exporting nations provided steady demand for treasuries. The petrodollar system replaced gold as the anchor supporting dollar dominance. But unlike gold, oil was consumed. Demand was perpetual, not just for reserves, but for actual use. But the system created winners and losers on a massive scale. Oil importing developing nations suffered catastrophically. The International Monetary Fund estimated that the foreign debts of 100 oil importing developing countries increased by 150% between 1973 and 1977. These nations faced a brutal squeeze. Oil prices had quadrupled, forcing them to spend far more on energy. They had to acquire dollars to pay those elevated prices, and they had to borrow to finance the difference, often at high interest rates from the same Western banks that were profiting from petrodollar recycling. Johan Witteveen, managing director of the IMF, declared in 1974 that the international monetary system is facing its most difficult period since the 1930 seconds. The IMF created an emergency lending program called the Oil Facility, funded partially by oil exporting states, to help nations cope with acute balance of payments, crises caused by oil price shocks. Italy and the United Kingdom sought assistance, as did dozens of developing nations. The geopolitical implications were equally profound. The petrodollar system gave the United States enormous leverage over global affairs. Countries that needed energy needed dollars. Countries that needed dollars needed access to American financial markets. This created dependencies that could be weaponized. Economic sanctions became far more powerful when they could cut nations off from dollar-based transactions. The global financial system, increasingly centered on dollar settlement, gave Washington a stranglehold that no empire had possessed when trade occurred in gold or multiple national currencies. The system also shaped American foreign policy in lasting ways. Maintaining Saudi cooperation became a paramount interest. The United States defended Saudi Arabia militarily, sold the kingdom advanced weapons, and supported the regime politically, despite significant tensions over human rights and other issues. Similar relationships developed with other Gulf monarchies. Access to oil-producing regions and ensuring those regions priced oil in dollars became central to American strategic thinking. For nearly 5 decades, the petrodollar system operated as the invisible architecture supporting American economic dominance. But architecture, no matter how impressive, doesn't last forever. By the 2022, cracks had become visible. The dollar's share of global currency reserves, while still dominant, has declined. In 2000, over 70% of identified reserves were held in dollars. By recent measurements, that figure has fallen to approximately 60%. The decline might seem modest, but it represents a significant shift in a system defined by network effects and inertia. Multiple factors drive this evolution. The rise of China as an economic superpower has created demand for alternatives to dollar dominance. The European Union, despite its internal challenges, offers the euro as a potential rival reserve currency. Countries facing American sanctions, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, have strong incentives to develop payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. China and Saudi Arabia have held discussions about pricing some oil sales in yuan rather than dollars. Russia has shifted much of its commodities trade with China to yuan settlement. India has explored rupee-based payment systems for oil purchases. These aren't yet dominant trends, but they represent the first serious challenges to petrodollar hegemony since the system's creation. In June 2024, a symbolic milestone passed largely unnoticed by mainstream media. 50 years after the 1974 agreements, the informal arrangements between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached what some analysts called an expiration point. Saudi Arabia announced openness to pricing oil in multiple currencies. While the kingdom hasn't abandoned dollar pricing, the willingness to consider alternatives signals shifting calculations. Digital currencies add another dimension to this evolution. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are being developed by dozens of nations. China's digital yuan is already in advanced testing. These technologies could potentially allow international settlement without correspondent banking relationships, reducing the need for dollar intermediation in cross-border transactions. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and expanding membership, have explicitly discussed creating alternative payment systems and potentially a common currency for trade. While these proposals face enormous practical challenges, their mere discussion indicates that dollar dominance no longer feels inevitable to major economies. For the United States, the implications of declining dollar dominance are profound. The ability to borrow cheaply could erode as foreign demand for treasuries weakens. Trade deficits that have been easily financed might become more burdensome. Most significantly, the power to impose financial sanctions would diminish if targeted nations could simply transact in alternative currencies and settlement systems. The story of American economic shifts changing the world isn't ancient history. It's living structure that shapes current events. When you see news about oil prices, remember that those prices exist in dollars because of decisions made in 1974. When you read about currency reserves or international lending, remember that the institutions managing those reserves and loans were created in 1944 to serve a system designed around American dominance. When economists discuss inflation or monetary policy, remember that the ability to print money unconstrained by gold began in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. 3 times in 80 years, American policymakers made decisions that restructured how the entire world conducts economic affairs. The Bretton Woods Agreements of 1944 made the dollar the central reserve currency and created institutions that still govern international finance. The Nixon shock of 1971 severed the last link between money and physical commodities, ushering in the era of pure fiat currency. The petrodollar agreements of 1974 tied energy markets to dollar denomination, creating perpetual demand for American currency. Each shift concentrated economic power in Washington. Each created asymmetries where American advantages came at others' expense, and each was presented as solving a crisis or maintaining stability, which was partially true. But the deeper truth is that these shifts served American interests, and other nations had little choice but to accept the new rules. But systems built on power rather than consent carry inherent instability. As American economic dominance erodes, as other powers rise, as technology enables alternatives, the architecture created by those 3 shifts faces its greatest test. The 4th shift may be beginning now, and this time America may not control the outcome. The world is watching to see whether dollar dominance can survive in a multipolar economic environment, whether institutions created to serve American hegemony can adapt to a more balanced distribution of power, and whether the financial architecture of the 20th century can survive the 21st. History suggests that no economic system lasts forever. The gold standard collapsed, Bretton Woods collapsed. Even the petrodollar system, which has endured for 50 years, shows signs of strain. What comes next will depend not just on American policy, but on decisions made in Beijing, Riyadh, Brussels, Moscow, and capitals across the developing world that have borne the costs of dollar dominance for decades. If this gave you a new perspective on how American economic decisions shape the world you live in, hit that subscribe button. Understanding the architecture of global finance means understanding who holds power and why. History has the answers, and the patterns reveal more than the headlines ever will.